just ask Ron online, because I know he's kind of an expert in this, but I feel like these conclusions contradict what we know from conflict studies in terms of the resource curse and the role of resources, or what I would say is territorial value, or value of territory, or market, black market or other value of territory, and war and conflict, right? Because the conclusion is that the higher the market value of the territory, the more likely they are to resolve the dispute. And I think that is against what conflict studies say. So, I don't know.
I know, but this is why I think it's very interesting, actually, to have those, is because this is the perspective of the, it's from the perspective of the resolved dispute by the International Court of Justice. It's not from the perspective of, the correlate of war studies, obviously, which has a huge database of wars, right? Yeah. But again, if we look at the correlate of war studies, and we look, and I've written on this and published on this, when we look at the reasons why we have territorial disputes, why we have war stories because of territorial disputes in 700 cases, and the correlate of war studies had to actually expand its from 3 variables to 9 to be able to show that very often it was internal disputes to a given state. So they start with 3 and they add 5 categories of basically territorial disputes that are internal to pre-existing states. So in other words, it's a political community within a state that contests the authority of the state in some regions. And I think that's really interesting, because once you would have and I haven't done, the next step would be to take every single case of the correlate of war disputes and look at International Court of Justice to see if the value of the land then would have had an impact on the resolution. But just from the small perspective of a number of international court decisions or recommendations, you can see that that's the direction it's taking. Where there is more value, the disputes are more easily resolved than if there isn't. Which I think, I totally agree with you, it's completely counterintuitive. Like, for me, it's like when I wrote it and I published it, and it's, it's not very cited, but I published it even in French, and my colleagues were quite impressed with the results, but it's like, well, what, I don't know, maybe the two different perspectives are not like confronting each other, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation, very fascinating. Question about the European Union as it is today. So theoretically, from an outsider, it looks like it's one country. Free movement of goods and people, no immigration, they could work, there is common union, medical card. Within that union, there is still some Schengen crap there going on.
Yeah.
So within that Schengen, would you consider there are still borders between those countries that are Schengen members, or are they, or there is no border?
No, yeah, so that's, so, but that's not about territorial disputes. It's just that you basically have...
Just borders,
That's right. You have 2 treaties, right? You have the European Union Treaty that, let's say, would have to do with free flow of goods and people. That's the idea, right? But then it's superimposed by the Schengen Treaty, which is actually a bit smaller, and has agreed to, in a way, limit the free flow of people, but not of good. This is why the backstop position in Ireland, Northern Ireland, with the UK is so difficult. It's because the 2 maps, the 2 maps, the map of Ireland, let's assume that is the map of Ireland, it's my hand, right? And the map of independent UK without the EU actually overlap. So free flow of goods, the map of the European community, right, economic community, includes the whole of the island. So all the goods can trade freely into the EU. But the people of Northern Ireland are part of the UK. So you have 2 maps that overlap. And how do you resolve these two maps is actually by having the UK completely part of Schengen or not, or having Northern Ireland outside of the European Economic Community or not. But there are two different treaties, and the EU wants to maintain, in a way, this superposition until the southern border, so the border of Northern Ireland with the rest of the island, is completely immaterial. To protect peace, because they think that if they cannot protect market flows, it will create poverty in the north, which will be a trigger for more violence. So Schengen, in a way, restricts, right? But in this case, it would protect Northern Irelanders. I mean, this is kind of an interesting conundrum, but that's the way it's done. Free flow of good against free flow of people. Do you want to say something?
Yes, one small remark, one small question. What is the difference you could make between the common mode of functional gestion of shared natural resources and the concept you are defending about the functional border? So, do you think we could? Do you think it's the same, or do you think it's different? The common management of a shared natural resource and the functional border. Do you think when two countries sign a treaty in order to manage commonly like a stock of fish or a forest or a mountain or a sea, do you think it's linked to the concept of functional border?
I do. So when we discuss, for instance, fisheries and boundaries in the Salish Sea, I say that we need to identify all of the different natural resources, or all of the different populations, all of the different people who live in the Salish Sea, and give them functional status. So the boundary line is not the international boundary line anymore. It's belonging to that exceptional status. Because right now, what do? We create chains of territories, right? So we have, let's say, a natural reserve for, let's say, fisheries, and then we say this is implemented in this region and this region and these regions, and we have 5 or 6 different regions where we know that certain fish will be. And I say that, no, we don't need this. We need a blanket agreement that disregards the territorial part, disregards the geography, and says, in those seas, or in this sea, let's say salmon are free. That's it. So we go to we itemize, we go to a functional bordering. So we identify a specific exception to the rule of the territory and the boundary line, and we generalize it for that item. So now a free trade treaty is not any different. Yes, a free trade treaty is exactly the same idea. Free trade is an exception to national trade. It identifies a list of goods that have the right to free flow across different territories. So why don't we do this with water, with air, with animals, with vegetation, and so on and so forth. So these are functional borders. They basically board or give rights across vast spaces for the mobility of these things. And it could be applied to humans, but that's more difficult because most mobility issues, as we have argued, as I have argued in the past, and I'm arguing in writing right now, actually really rooted in politics of space. So that's the very fundamental difference. The politics of space dominate today very, very strongly human mobility.
There's a couple questions coming in. Do you know of any water disputes that have been resolved satisfactorily? Water wars is often a label for one of the most dangerous resource wars.
No, actually, so this is kind of interesting. It's the reverse. And Simon Dalby, who has worked with us on Borders and Globalization, keeps on reminding me that all of the database we have on water disputes point to the fact that water disputes have a high proportion, not all of them, right, but have a very high proportion of being resolved peacefully. And I don't know the exact reason for, but if you're interested, you can write us, and I will send you the links, because there is database that's on this issue. We have lots of resources, lots of data on this. So that's the answer. Simon Dalby is right now the environmental security chair at Wilfrid Laurier, and he worked with Borders and Globalization all these last 6 years, and he's finishing a number of writing, including a book on, environmental, the Anthropocene and borders. That's what his book is doing. So if you're interested, just write us, and I can follow up on this.
Okay, and then coming back to these three categories, territorial disputes and positional disputes offer the possibility of settlement once and for all. But functional disputes require continuing capacity for ongoing monitoring and collaboration and governance. Collaborative cross-boundary administration.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think the way I look at it is this way. We have three categories of disputes which have very different tools at their service, right? And I agree with you. Positional disputes, it's a technological issue. It's the rewriting of a treaty. You need lawyers, you need, geographers, you need cartographers, maybe with GPS, to basically look at the old treaties, look at the position, like the ambit of where the boundary line can be the borderland. Basically, you want to reduce this ambit as much as possible to get it to be a minute point on the map, and then you need to map it out both on the land, and you need to map it out, obviously, in the treaties. So you need to have maps that are attached to the treaties that are extremely precise. That process is still in the making, but we have the tools to resolve these issues, right? These positional disputes, we can do it because we have the GPS, because we have the rule of law. Functional disputes can be resolved fairly easily because it has to do, functional dispute can be resolved fairly easily when they have to do with sharing resources. Right? When you have a nature reserve, when you have whatever wealth that you want to protect and that is shared or it's straddling the boundary line, cooperation is the way to resolve them. It's different when the states, let's say, I believe that the US and Mexico have a functional dispute about labor. They can agree on what is the role of the boundary line in the monitoring of labor flows. And this is very difficult to resolve, but they were, and they've been very successful to this day in resolving the flow of goods across their boundary line. So see, this is really why I say that mobility, human mobility issues can be a very kind of difficult functional dispute, but trade is not. I think it's kind of interesting to see this because really Mexico is part of the Canadian-US market and Canada is part of the US-Mexico market for many goods. We don't share energy. Mexico doesn't share energy with the US and Canada, but Canada and the US share the exact same market for electricity. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting to see this. So the boundary obviously is not the boundary line. It's where the market is that is actually bounding these things. It's close to what Benjamin was asking me. These are functional borders. So that's my answer.
And
sorry. He points out that he didn't see on your list any mention of U.S.-Mexico disputes over groundwater for the Rio Grande.
Yeah, indeed. We didn't put them in, it's true. You know, there are some disputes that we could have put that we didn't. And it indeed is a really difficult one. And it will not go in becoming easier because most of the water, probably if you ask the question is because you're fully aware of this, is that most of the water comes from the Mexican side, which is counterintuitive here again. So for instance, San Diego depends on water coming from the other side, and it's not the only largest urban space on the US side that depends on water being on the Mexican side. So yes, I'm sure that's why you're asking the question. We could have gone there, but we didn't include them. I'm not sure why. Probably the specialists that could have written the case, because I had to be very pragmatic. I was under a deadline to do all of this. Just didn't deliver or could not deliver on time, and that's why we didn't include there. Yeah.
Can you go back to your list of functional board? I'm thinking also, what about something like the Columbia River Treaty between, is that a dispute?
Do we have it in here? I don't think we have it in here. Do we?
No, but I'm wondering if that is a dispute.
No, there is no. I don't think. I actually don't even think that the Columbia, because we have a treaty.
Yeah. So therefore, there is no dispute.
There is no dispute, and the renegotiation could lead to a dispute. But why would it? Because it's never been disputed in the past, right? And it's actually a well-administered treaty, which is just being rediscussed now because the boundary lines of the watershed have shifted a bit, and also because I guess non-governmental partners in the treaties, or the people that are most concerned by that treaty, which are not just electric corporations, but all of the First Nations and all of the settlers community across the watersheds, are really very much involved today and concerned by what the treaty is going to do to them, because it's kind of a overarching regulatory system to where they live, right? It has tremendous implications on all kind of aspects of their lives. Not just the nature they live in, but also the resources they have access to and how the resources are used. So,
could we imagine a fourth category of border dispute? When we think about the extraterritorial action of USA for in order to control a data center of Facebook in Ireland. How? In which category? And maybe it's a territorial dispute. So we need a fourth volume of border dispute. So I could ask you, where do you fix this kind of territorial disputes when some states are using the normative extraterritoriality power to control some other countries?
Territorial functional disputes. They are territorial.
We have a lot of imagination, but
they're territorial functional disputes, aren't they? There would be disagreement about the territorial anchorage, right? So they're territorial functional disputes. They have to do with the exploitation of a very specific function, right? It's a very specific global function that would have a territorial anchorage outside, and so how is it regulated? So it would be a territorial functional dispute. But it couldn't be territorial, it couldn't be positional, right?
No, it's not one of them.
So it has to be functional. Other questions or comments?
Sorry, just on the CRT, on the Columbia renegotiation, this fascinating example of the way that the context can be transformed dramatically in ways that call into question the future legitimacy of the earlier deal.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things, I don't know who's asking the question, but I think this is so true because, one of the issues that we have is that the watershed has moved, right, in the last 50-something years. Obviously, the watershed has moved, and so even though it's just two international parties that are involved, the state and provinces and all of the lower level partners, governments, non-profits, economic actors that are involved in the renegotiations are not the same, and also they are much more powerful today than they were in the past. So obviously these treaties have a life of themselves that I think change things greatly. Also, environmental and indigenous concerns are much, much higher today on the political agenda. So I think that these obviously change the very nature of the treaty today. Maybe this is why both governments are struggling with the renegotiation. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not behind them, but and I haven't studied them. We have students who have studied them, and actually, highlight how First Nations are so well aware of the implication of the treaty have, and settlers communities as well are very, very well aware of how these, treaties, such a treaty and the various aspects of the treaty has tremendous implication on their well-being. So they won't let go. I don't know if they'll be heard, but they won't let go for now. They're quite concerned. Yeah?
And could you highlight the effects, the impacts of globalization over these three kind of disputes? Where are the links? Where are the connections? Well, in a nutshell, because it could be very. I have a lot of questions, huh? Because we are studying borders and globalization. How could we link the dynamism of this kind of disputes? Maybe it's a real connection, real direct connection, or maybe not.
Well, in the study of borders, I think this slide is really important because it shows us that areas that have high economic value, and I have insisted on the economic value of the land, but I'm thinking in the case of Israel, it has other economic value than just the land. It's the economic value of the human capital that has been produced over the last 55 years of the existence of the Israeli state, right? But that's I don't want to just focus on Israel. I just want to show that there is a broader understanding of what is economic value, and what is located basically on that land becomes a strong determinant for the resolution of disputes. So in borders and globalization, or in the global world in which we live today, certain areas have a really quite clear competitive advantage to others, which for me is an interesting case because it shows that the position the EU has taken for Northern Ireland, for instance, where you do have a contested boundary between the north and the south, because a lot of people in the south, right, in the Republic of Ireland would like to have the whole island being a republic. And there are also lots of people actually that live in Northern Ireland that would like to see the same. It's the end of the old colonial history of the UK in Ireland, right? That's kind of the way you could put it if you look at history. But I think the whole, and that part of the world is actually quite poor. Northern Ireland is not very rich. Without the economic subsidies of the European Union today, the agriculture will be wiped out, literally, right? 80 pence per pound of agricultural trade is subsidized. 80 pence per pound. 80% of every single trading item that is an agricultural product today is subsidized by EU funds. So when you look at this, you do have questions, but I think that borders and globalization and the work we've done shows us that the economic value of the territory that are disputed is a strong determinant for the resolution of disputes. That means that human ethnic disputes or strategic territories becomes much less an issue. I mean, it becomes a huge humanitarian issue. But we don't have the tools to resolve them. That's why I would like us to study much more that issue, because I think the international community needs to think, how do you resolve these issues? Are you going to just have, what has happened in Syria again and again and again happen in the rest of the world? I think it's something we need to discuss. We don't have the tools today to resolve these issues. So globalization puts and polarizes even more, I would say, these findings. Maybe they're counterintuitive, and Nicole seems to say, oh, no, it's very different from conflict studies, right? On the other hand, I think these are real facts. I'm not like, we have all the data. It's like right there, you know? You ask court judges in The Hague and ask them, they'll tell you that this is true. They know that this is actually the problem they have. I saved the email, by the way, of our colleague, because he's an Italian, I mean, I shouldn't say all, but he's an Italian scholar. That's why I wrote him. And he's a specialist of maritime disputes.
There's another question. After Brexit, Northern Ireland would lose those subsidies. Does ethnic difference trump, pun intended, economic ones when Northern Ireland votes for Brexit?
Huh. Well, I'll say that I think the EU is fully aware of that, and this is why they've decided that the backstop would actually be a non-negotiable item. It's a non-negotiable item for the EU. It's something that they are. We'll see what happens, right? But it's something that they've been extremely firm on. It's because they want to maintain peace. Whereas I'm not convinced that on the UK side there is the same determination to maintain peace. I think ideas of sovereignty and ideas of nationalism that root obviously ideas of sovereignty for some of the Brexiters are much, much stronger than any economic rationale whatsoever. So I can't really explain their position, but I do understand that where they root their position, and I do understand the EU position. The EU position is, in a way, kind of simple. It's that we throw money at a problem so that we have peace. We're not going to stop throwing money because we want peace. And the rationale behind it is that the EU is a peacemaking machine before everything else. It was born out of the Second World War. The reason why the EU was created, and the reason why there is, first of all, communities about monitoring the construction of war machine, steel and coal communities are very early, right? They are the first two, and then we have Euratom, and then we have economic. It's because we want to throw money at war, and we want to basically control economic growth because we believe that there is a strong correlation between full bellies and peace. So that's the basic rationale for Brexit from the EU perspective. I don't know what the Conservatives and the Brexiters' fundamental rationale is because they've stayed, first of all, because they have used a lot of lies to make their argument, and so it's quite difficult to understand exactly what they're after. But also I think that because they are fundamentally rooted in the value of nationalism and the protection of sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So there's another comment here from Rod that says, of course, this question introduces all, I think Ron's earlier question about ethnic versus economic. This question introduces all the challenges of achieving compliance and acceptance of all these peace-seeking dispute resolution procedures and decisions.
Yes, of course. Yes. This is one of the weakness of the international system, right? The international public system is made on recommendations. Very often, what the court does is before it, just a few months before it publishes its recommendation, it goes back to the different member states and asks, can you publicly state that you will respect our recommendation? And it doesn't happen every single time. There are cases where the states are disappointed and refuse, even though they have said that they would, implement the recommendation. There is no such thing in the international public system, international law system that imposes onto state a penalty if they don't respect a decision over a border dispute. That's the strength and weakness of the system.
And then, so in reference again to Rod's, and the question becomes then why people believe those lies. Identity politics leads to believing lies and not voting in one's own economic interests. For example, the working class supporting Bush and now Trump.
We need to be better at, and this is something that I think lots of democracies, it has nothing to do with my talk though. But I think that, one of the problems we have here is obviously that we are entering a new age we've entered in the 1970s and 80s, the information communication revolution, as was identified by Emmanuel Castell, and that our culture with regard to information and communication has not evolved as quickly. So it is being used and manipulated in ways that our anti-governance system and states are actually to this day, unable to actually really control well. So democracy is at risk in many places around the world because of manipulation of information. It doesn't mean that it's a done deal. On the contrary, I think it's being discussed worldwide. But we know for sure that lots of negotiations, we know for sure that lots of elections have been manipulated since probably the last 8 or 10 years, right? Including Brexit. And we know that Facebook has played a great role in influencing people because it allows for certain political platform and groups to target and send communication and information that is false or made up to scare people. And it's been done in Nigeria, it's been done during the Brexit referendum, it's been done in France in the last election, at the time when Macron was against Le Pen. It's been done in the US, and it's not the end of it.
My computer died, so if they want to keep weighing in, they need to unmute their mics. But one of the last, that was Ron, again, he was saying, sorry for, setting it off on a tangent, but he found your answer on EU as a peacemaking machine is too compelling to not weigh in on it.
Oh yeah, for sure. Okay, thank you, Ron.
Anyways, if those guys want to keep weighing in, they can unmic. We only have about 5 minutes left, so maybe we should wrap up nonetheless.
We can hear you if you take the mute on your mic off. So you have about 2 or 3 minutes to ask questions if you want to go on. Because the computer is gone. The computer doesn't work anymore.
I warned them in advance if that was going to happen because I could see it happening.
Okay, Rod?
Just a quick comment. I think your talk is closely connected to these issues. The acceptance of the dispute resolutions accepted by states, other institutions, increasingly are rejected by individuals or what you might call rogue groups in a sense. So the link is quite strong. It's just that you're speaking more at the level of state institutions, and the rejection is occurring more at a populist level.
I see. Thank you. I think that's actually a good comment. I hadn't thought about this, so I can't really reply to it, but yes, maybe there is also this going on today. Any other comments in the room? Questions? Or should we just close here?
I'm good.
So Xavier Serrano and Rod Dobell, thank you very much for attending. And I think we have a third person, but I don't know.
Calliston.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
And we'll be back again, same time, same place, in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, yes.
For summary or lessons learned
Yeah,
from
so
Big.
that will be on the summary of Big, and I think it's you'll see it's quite fascinating because we are rewriting the literature on border studies with this research program. The three of us here at the end of the table, we're aware of it, and we know from the feedback that we got at the last borderland studies meeting 3 weeks ago, that people were very impressed with the findings and the publications that we have. So, and I'm talking, Europeans and people from Asia and so on and so forth. So I think if you're interested in the future of border studies, you should attend. I'd be delighted to have your questions then as well. I'm going to close. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.